Welcome, everybody, to another episode of the Rising Tide Leadership Podcast, Identity and Influence. I'm sitting here with Dr. Lem Usita. Dr. Lem, what's up?
What's up, Mo? Good to see you, man. Thanks for letting me be on here.
Man, it's really good to have you. We are going to be talking about some very cool stuff today. And for those who are just tuning in for the first time, Dr. Lem and I have chosen to go over quite a few articles together. And Dr. Lem, why don't you just give us a little bit about what this article is about? It's called, you call it Leadership Lesson Number 4, What Drives Leadership? Why don't you give us a quick synopsis?
Yeah, thank you again for having me. Yeah, these are some leadership articles that I've written. There's 50 of them, so I just numbered them 1 through 50. A buddy of mine said I should write 2 more so I can have 50. But they're all just leadership lessons that I've learned throughout like my time in different leadership positions. And this one happens to be on power. And just, the fact that leadership needs power. Power is what drives leadership. Power is the engine of the car of leadership. There isn't anything that you hear or bad about power in the way that we're going to talk about it. But whenever you wield one of these power bases in order to use. And so if leadership is influence, you use one of these power bases to influence. And having an understanding of the power bases helps you to better influence and lead. And so that's kind of the idea of this particular article.
So, in this article, you write that leadership is fundamentally driven by power. However, you emphasize that power and leadership isn't inherently good or bad, it's neutral until it's applied. So, can you
Yeah,
elaborate on what power means, why understanding it is so crucial?
yeah. Later on in this conversation, we'll probably get into Lord Acton's, little phrase where he says that, where it says that power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. We'll get into that and what that means. But I think a lot of people, when they think about power, that's what they go to first. That having power is this bad thing. And it's not necessarily, and we're not necessarily talking about it as a good or bad, as much as we are taking a look at it theoretically. What are the power bases that we wield when we lead? So that's the focus. That's why I wanted to write about it. Like power it isn't bad to have power, but I think it helps us in our leadership. We understand which power base to wield when we lead.
So, how do you personally define leadership power, and how is your understanding of it evolved over your many years of leadership?
So power drives leadership. Power is the engine for leadership. What can I do to build up my influence? I can learn to understand and know what kind of power base to wield and use when I lead. So in a particular situation, like I have all of these power bases available to me, and I can choose the right one to get, to actually you can choose any of them, but like the outcome, you may get the desired outcome, but you may hurt people in the process, or you may lose some influence in the process. And so understanding which power base to wield in a given situation gives me nuance to my leadership. It gives me some categories to develop my leadership and help me to be more effective. If leadership is influence, it's allowing you the opportunity to influence.
So, explain to us these power bases and their significance and why they're what make leadership effective.
Okay, so French and Raven are these researchers, and they came up with this framework of power bases. Understanding this framework and understanding these concepts really helped me to understand um, how I was leading and how to better lead. And so there are these 5 power bases, that the original 5 power bases, and then Raven, like 6 years later, added another power, but we'll kind of get to that. So the first power base is what they call coercive power. This is the power to punish or coerce others into doing something. It operates on fear and threat of negative consequences. So leaders who rely on coercive power often use sanctions, penalties, or withdrawals of privilege to influence behavior. And so while coercive power can be effective in the short term, it can lead to resentment and disengagement with overuse. So Coercive power equals punishment power. Pretty simple. Reward power is the power to reward others for their actions, whether through praise, promotions, financial incentives, and other benefits. So leaders who use reward power understand that people are motivated by positive reinforcement. However, it's important for leaders to be mindful how they distribute rewards, because out of it, you can foster favoritism, or inconsistency can erode trust and diminish the effectiveness of reward power. So once you keep rewarding, like, they're going to want bigger rewards and they're going to want it more often. You know what I mean? And so, like, if you're only using reward power, like, it feels good and there's positive reinforcement, but the overuse of this power can have like uh consequences that erode your trust and your influence. So reward power is just the power to legitimate power. This is the power. This is the next power. It's legitimate. This is power that comes from a formal position or role. So it's positional power. It often refers to, you know, the power of the office, positional power, the head coach, president of the United States, the CEO. It's their position as the leader. So people follow leaders with legitimate power because they recognize their authority based on their title and position. However, legitimate power alone is not enough to sustain long-term leadership effectiveness. It must be complemented by other forms of power, particularly when followers question and challenge the leader's authority. So legitimate power is positional. And as you're seeing, like, so far, these power bases, the more you use it, if you only use one of it lessens your impact. The fourth power base is expert power. This is the power based on knowledge or expertise. So leaders who have expert powers are followed because they are seen as knowledgeable or skilled in a particular area. Their authority comes from their confidence and people trust their judgment. Expert power is highly valuable, especially in technical fields or areas requiring specialized knowledge. However, here's like the downside of this power is leaders who rely solely on expert power can run the risk of becoming disconnected from the interpersonal or relationship aspect. And so you can have expert power, but if you only use that and you use it too much, you lose that interpersonal or relational aspect of you. Now, you notice in these first four power bases, coercive, reward, legitimate, and expert power, they're good in the short term, but if you only wield one of these powers in the long term, you lose some of these. The last power base is called referent power. And this is, I think, the differentiator. This is often considered the most powerful form of leadership power. It's the most powerful power base. Referent power is based on personal traits or relationships. Leaders with referent power are followed because people admire, respect, and identify with them. It's the "I will follow you" kind of power, based not on coercion or formal authority, but on the leader's ability to build strong relationships and inspire endurance. In many ways, referent power is the ultimate measure of leadership effectiveness because it speaks of the leader's ability to create trust, respect, and emotional connections with followers. So referent power is that, like, "I will follow you anywhere" power. Referent power is also the only power base that needs to be given to the leader. Like, you can earn positional power, you can earn reward, the ability to reward people or coerce people, and you can gain the knowledge and expertise of the leader. But if you don't have referent power is the only power that someone gives to you. You can't wield it unless somebody gives it to you. You know what I'm saying? And so that's what makes it the most powerful power base. And I think it's the only power base where the more you use it, the more influence and the more, like, power you have. Whereas the first four power bases, the more you use it and only use that power base, like, it kind of lessens your influence. But if you use any of these power bases with referent power, you actually grow in your influence and you grow in your leadership. The last power base that Raven added like 6 years later is called information power, and it's different than expertise. Because expert power is knowledge, but also like an ability and competency, right? They have the knowledge and the vocabulary, and you trust them, like a doctor or a lawyer. Like, I don't need to understand a doctor or a lawyer. They have expert power. They have expertise that like I am paying for or I'm relying on. So that's what like power looks like. Information is a little bit different in that like there doesn't need to be any competency or there doesn't need to be any ability tied into information. Information alone, just by itself, has power. So if I have some information on, you know, the stock market, if I have information in organization about something that we're doing, I have power over other people in that organization that don't have that information. But once I give that information to someone else, they also have that power. So information, although added later and is a definitely a power base that you can use. It's not one of the original ones. So I kind of stick to just the original 5 power bases. But that's like just a quick overview of these power bases. And then understanding these power bases really helps you better influence and helps you grow in your leadership ability.
So it's funny when I hear you talk about these. You know, I mean, I'm a big John Maxwell fan. He has
Yeah,
what he calls his 5 levels of leadership. And when I hear you talk about referent power, I think
yeah,
of John
yeah,
Maxwell's level 5, which is what he
yeah,
calls the pinnacle level. It's the
yeah.
highest level of leadership, and people follow you not because of what you do anymore, but they follow you
Who you
because
are.
of who you are and what you represent. Let me ask you this: which of these power bases, and I already know the answer, but I want to hear you say it. Which of these power bases do you think is the most underutilized by leaders today, and why?
Yeah, it would definitely be reference power. It's the most powerful of the power bases. It's actually also probably the one that needs the most practice, right? It's the hardest to attain because again, this power base has to be given to you. You can't just wield it like it has to be given to you. And so, when you ask what is, why do you think it's underutilized? It's hard. Leadership is hard. Like we keep saying that, and that's why we practice it, and that's why we talk about it, and that's why we learn about it. And I think these power bases give us some categories to better lead. And yeah, if leaders would just work on, first of all, understanding the power base and then developing their referent power with their team lives, you grow in your influence and you become a better leader.
So, do the authors have a percentage of how many leaders actually get to the referent power level? How do we know if we're getting close? Also, should we be striving for that kind of power? Is that something that is going to take away from the humility of a leader?
Well, there's a lot there. John Maxwell also talks about the law of the leadership lid, and you can only lead people to your level of leadership. And so, if you're 7, you can maybe lead people to a 6, or if you're 4, lead. You can't develop a leader to a 10 if you're only a 4. You can develop them to a 2 or 3. Maybe a 4 if you're a 4, but typically you need to like your level. And so I don't know that Finch and Raven necessarily gave any percentages, but still, even just in your question, we talked about it later. You hear about power, you're already thinking, well, power corrupts, and more power is like not good. And so that's why, like from the beginning, as you mentioned, it's not necessarily good or bad. Like in some cases, I want somebody to have higher level of expertise than I do, and I don't care to be in a relationship with them. Like my pilot that flies the plane, I want him to be like, I don't necessarily need to talk to him, and he doesn't need to have any kind of reference power over me, but he better have the expertise to take off and land this plane. You know what I mean? And I think in some management positions, when you're in like, some factory job or some job where you just like, this is just a deal, and you're you know, developing this thing. I mean, reference power, I still think helps because you're encouraging people, but you can use just expert power in a particular setting. Like the military uses coercive power. The military uses reward. The military also uses positional. The military also uses expertise power. They use all of these power bases, but what sets apart a leader in the military is somebody that's good with people, somebody that understands people. Because in the military, like they're just giving you orders. You can't question those orders. I mean, you can question them, but not out loud. You don't necessarily like have a debate with, the leader, the captain or the general. You're not like sitting there like, well, let's think about this. that doesn't happen. And like, if you're on the front line somewhere, you're not questioning, you've trained to execute, you're given an order and that's what you do. Coercive power, reward power. You see how these powers are kind of, playing out. And so I don't think necessarily it's a good or bad thing. Again, like that's part of the reason why, I wrote about this. Like having more power isn't necessarily bad. But understand that if you have more power, it can corrupt, right? You can use it selfishly. So, later we can talk about like the humility and the self-reflection that it takes to not use power for.
So, can you share a story or an example of a leader that effectively uses one or more of these power bases to achieve some kind of results?
Yeah, the first one that comes to mind is when I was in higher education. I knew this RD, this resident director, and like he would only ever use coercive power, like just to punish people. And and then he also had legitimate power. He had power as, he had a positional power, but he only ever used it to like bust people or, get people if they got in trouble, and he'd like just write them up. That's all he was known for. And so if that's the only power you're ever using, like you're not going to be well liked, you know what I mean? And then people will follow you because you have positions, but like you don't necessarily build like trust culture, when you're leading only in that way. I personally experienced a board, like I was working for a board and they had information and they weren't sharing any of that information with me. And so like when your board isn't shared information with me, for whatever reason, it's hard to leak. And so if you have information and you're withholding that from people and you use it against them, but like, that's an example of informational power. And again, there's so many examples of referent power. People that, like for instance, John Maxwell. He's got referent power. I've given him referent power. Whatever book he writes, I just saw like his latest book, clicked on it, and like I'm gonna get that book, there's a whole bunch of authors that if they write a book, there's no question I'm not gonna, figure out whether I want that book or not because they have referent power and I've given them referent power. I'm gonna buy their book. I want them to influence me. I want to read their ideas. And, understanding referent power really helps you to, better lead and better influence people.
So, leadership power, how you point out, it can be misused. So, what are some of
Mhm.
the most common ways that leaders misuse power? And what are the consequences when they have those missteps?
Yeah. Just like we mentioned earlier, if you just use the first four power bases for too long, they have negative effects on your leadership influence. Again, um, if you're only leading with coercive power and you're only punishing, you're not building people up, then you'll have a team and followers that resent you. If you're only using reward power, your team will then only expect they'll expect more rewards and they'll expect bigger rewards each time. And when they don't get it, then again, you lose influence and you lose trust with the team. And again, with legitimate power, positional power, just because you're the leader doesn't mean that you've won their hearts. There's a relational like component here. They'll follow you because of your position, but similar to others, if that's the only one you use, like it just won't last. Um, these are, I mean, when you think about your leadership, and when you start to break down your leadership, you can take a look at how you use these power bases in your leadership, in what you've done in leadership. Do I have the trust of the team? Do they respect me as a leader? Do I have all the information as a leader? And you do your best in leadership, but if you can do so out of that referent power, that relational respect, I will follow you anywhere power, then you can get a lot done.
So, let's talk about building referent power then. You highlight that referent power is it's a critical asset in today's leadership, like the
Hmm.
landscape and everything we're doing. So, if this is an important part of authenticity, what are the practical steps that a leader can take to build and strengthen their referent power? Like, how do they do it? How do they get there?
Yeah. I love that as we talk about leadership and the different nuances of leadership, like it always comes back to the basics of developing your leadership. But in this case, you can use the other power bases, but don't use it alone and don't use just one power base. And like I was saying earlier, if you could also use reference power with these power bases, it really helps for you to care for your team and for those that follow you. You really start to develop a culture of trust. So building relationships really helps you to develop reference, being relational, walking into the office and sitting down to just ask them how they're doing, how their weekend went. I mean, that has nothing to do with work. That just really has everything to do with the person. So build your relationship with the team and the person. And then, just like we talked about pretty much every episode, find a mentor to help you develop the practices of these power bases. Now that you have these categories, you can start to think through and start reflecting on, like, how do I use coercive power? How do I use referent power? How do I use just expertise and positional power? How do I use referent power and expertise power and really care for my team and to build this culture? It just, again, just gives you more categories to develop your leadership and build a trust culture in your organization. And then again, just like every episode, I think we're going to bring this up every episode, but write and reflect on leadership practice. I cannot overemphasize, okay, this is what happened in leadership. This is what I did. This is the consequences of what I did. You either win, or you learn. And if it's not a good decision, then you learn from it. You try it again, you do it again. And writing and reflecting, going back to your vision and values for your leadership really just kind of helps you to develop, fostering that trust and authenticity and building reference power as one of the, powers that you need.
So if there's a leader out there that says, I still don't know if I buy it, what can you tell them that makes referent power so different from the other power bases, which will give an even greater long-term impact on culture and performance?
Yeah, if they're working on their leadership, they have a hero. If they have someone that they can look up to, that I want to be like this and I want to develop my leadership abilities so I can lead this person. Why? The reason why that is because they have referent power over you. You know, they've used referent power and you've given them the respect because you want to become like them. Like, every leader has that. Everyone has someone that they can look up to. And I mean, talk to somebody long enough and you start seeing their influences. You start seeing, like, the leaders that they read and others that they read and TV shows that they care about, the superheroes that, have influenced their lives, teachers that have influenced their lives. I still think we can use the power bases to help them be better leaders. I still think referent power is the most powerful power that you can wield. But if you choose to not believe in it or use it, like, I can't really make you. I mean, I could if I had positional power over you, but that's not effective, you know?
Right. So, I mean, when we're talking about balancing power bases, then if effective leadership requires balancing the different power bases depending on whatever situation we're in, how can
Yeah,
leaders develop and discern to know which power base to use and when? Because I would assume that not all power bases are right for every situation.
right, right. So sometimes you need to use coercive power for consequences, right? And that when it's appropriate. So someone breaks protocol, breaks the rules, doesn't follow rules, if they defect you as a leader, whatever. I mean, it's totally appropriate to use coercive power, punishment power for consequences, but also build them up. You know what I mean? But when you use coercive power for something that doesn't fit, right? That you actually start losing your ability to influence when you're just punishing, even when it's not necessary. I think about, like, head coaches that can power trip over their, just teams, as they develop teams. Like, if you're just making them run laps or whatever for punishment, oh yeah, you're helping them build cardio. You're just power tripping, man. And, like, I mean, there's an appropriate use for that, and there's the right time to use coercive power to teach a lesson. But if you're always doing that, if that's the only thing you're ever doing, it's really hard to motivate a team to play for you. You know what I mean? Like, they'll resent you as a coach, and they'll not want to work hard for you. So, it's appropriate. There are appropriate times to wield expert power, to wield coercive power. But when you're using this power in an inappropriate way or at the wrong time, it doesn't help you. Consequently, when you use referent power or respect uh, with any of these other power bases, it helps you have a positive experience with your team. It does so because you're also doing it relationally and not just out of position or authority. And so I think that relationship, that respect really goes a long way in developing a trust culture in leadership.
It's funny. So many coaches live in the coercive power realm. That's all
Yep.
they know.
Yep. Right.
And you can only live there so long. You have
Right.
to be able to get to the place where your players respect you and they want to follow you because they want to follow you, not because they have to follow you. And I think
Right.
those are the teams when the going gets tough, they rally behind.
They rise up. Yeah.
They do. They rise up as a team. They rise up for their coach. Let me ask you this. Are there tools or frameworks that leaders can use to reflect and assess the way that they use power in leadership?
There's absolutely tools and frameworks. I mean, we're talking about a framework right now, like this is French and Raven's power bases. And just do a search on Google and you can find a ton of videos of people explaining and talking about these power bases and how you can use them and develop your leadership influence. And again, journal, write, develop your reflective practices when it comes to leadership development. I think we're sharing these frameworks and these tools to develop as a leader. And so if someone doesn't want to develop as a leader, they're not really listening to this podcast or, doing any kind of work to develop their leadership. This is just for the people that want to work on their stuff. Yeah. So tools or frameworks, I mean, this is one that has really helped me in leadership. Because when people start leaning against me or they're following, I can look to see, okay, that leader is using this kind of power base. Or I, as a leader, I use this kind of power base. And if that doesn't work, then it gives me categories for okay, I'm going to try this again, but use a different power base or use a different combination of power bases in order to develop my influence with my team and those that I lead. So yeah, this is a framework, a conceptual framework that kind of helps you when you reread a lot of these other leadership books. Like now that you have these categories, it just helps you start thinking through the nuance of leadership. And so I think this is a really powerful one for me. So that's why I wrote about it.
So that's a great segue for us to talk about leadership and influence because that's really what we're about on this podcast.
Mm-hmm.
Your article makes a powerful point that leadership is fundamentally about influence. And
Right.
you know me, you got me right there with leadership as influence. How can leaders intentionally grow their ability to influence others in a way that inspires followership rather than just enforcing compliance?
Isn't Lencioni the one that wrote about the dysfunctions of a team, 5 dysfunctions?
Yes.
Wasn't that him? And the first thing that's needed right at the base of the whole thing is trust, right? And in order to be effective as a team, you have to develop trust. And if there isn't trust there for whatever reason, it's hard to lead a team. I've experienced this firsthand leading an organization where there just wasn't trust in me. And again, there's a ton of reasons for why that was, but you can't work again. I mean, if people are working against you, it's really, really hard to lead. But to build trust, to develop trust culture in your organization, you need to build relationships with your team or followers. And that's probably something that I could have done better. For sure, I could have done that better. I would have had more trust with the team if I had done that better. So just reflecting on my leadership practices, I mean, I believe in the principle, and so it's one of the things that I obviously didn't do in this organization. Then you can also model for your team your willingness to learn in leadership, to continually learn in leadership. Again, like we talked about before, it's not like you ever arrive as a leader. You can always be better and always grow and always learn and always take on a new framework or a new principles and then just practice it and develop it in your leadership. And then using these power bases, understanding these power bases and the balance of how to use these power bases so that you're not like wielding the wrong power at the wrong time, or that you're doing it in just a more effective way. I can't tell you how much this theoretical framework has really helped me to develop um my leadership influence. And obviously, if I recognize that somebody has given me reference, and if I can wield reference power, not for my benefit, but to help somebody, like it's just the most powerful power base that you can use. And so it just really helps you to be super influential.
Yeah. So, with all that being said, I want to follow up with something that I had mentioned earlier on and ask a
Hmm.
question, which is how do humility and self awareness then play into the leader's ability to influence effectively? Because when I think of leadership and what leaders need to do, they have to live in the realm of humility and self awareness. If you aren't, if you don't have humility, you're never going to get the trust of your team. If you don't have self awareness, you're never going to move to social awareness. So, what can a leader do?
So humility and self-awareness allows a leader to not react. It allows a leader, I think, to be present in the moment and not just react to something. I like to think that leaders don't react. Leaders can lead, and they're not necessarily react. I think managers react to things, but leaders, they don't react. There's a level of control and awareness that a leader needs to have, to take a look at the situation, pause, if you will, and to really assess what is the right power base to use in this particular situation. How can I best lead this situation and take care of the team, right? And again, sometimes you're going to win, most times you're going to win, and sometimes you're going to learn. But being able to pause and to be calm, and then honestly, to also have the humility as a leader to listen to what other people have to say, and the self-awareness to listen to other people on your team so that they can give you feedback so that you can make the best decision. Yeah, I agree with you. Humility and awareness plays a huge part in a leader's ability to influence, for sure. And to not react, I think, makes you an effective leader.
Let's talk about misconceptions about leadership then. In your journey of studying and practicing leadership, what are some of the biggest misconceptions that you've encountered about leadership and its connection to power?
Yeah. Power has a negative connotation to it, like I'm gonna lord my power over you. And back to the phrase that we brought up earlier, the British historian and moralist Lord Acton early in the 19th century said, power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely. And he's not wrong. We've seen tons of examples of leaders that have been corrupted by the power that they gain, and they do some corrupt things, and then they use their power selfishly for gain. It's kind of this idea that the more power you have as an individual, the more it weakens your sense of morality, right? And that's why you find leaders in compromising situations, and power actually corrupts people. But understanding the power bases actually help you to maintain humility, serve the team that you lead. It helps you to be a better leader by giving you categories to know which power base to use. Again, being able to pause and reflect and take a look at the situation and choose the right power base to wield in order to take care of the team, but then also be more effective in influencing as a leader. But yeah, it has power definitely has some negative connotations to it. And so part of writing about power, part of the reason why I love French and Raven's categories is because it helps me to reframe what power is and then to use power to be a better leader.
Yeah, and for those who don't know, Lord Acton, he had a really cool beard. So whatever he says, it must be gospels.
The wisdom of the beard, for sure.
The wisdom of the beard, you can't go against it. So
Yeah,
let me ask a follow-up question on that.
yeah,
So why do you think that these misconceptions persist? How can leaders challenge their own perception, their own practices, so that they're
yeah,
not just out there messing everything up?
yeah. Well, power feels good. Having the power feels good. Ever been to an event and somebody has like the jacket or the whistle or the clipboard. People love it, man. People like with the clipboard, like, oh, I got the clipboard. I have all the information, or I have the whistle. Like, people love power. And I think that's why the Lord Acton line really is effective, because power can corrupt. And I think, you know, again, having these categories and having these understanding and knowledge of these power bases kind of help you, it gives you information about yourself and the situation, so that you lead in a way that you build trust and you develop other people and you grow your influence. But I think that misconception persists because people love their power. People love being connected to people with power. People love, I mean, it just feels good, and to develop again, awareness to be better, um, I think is a worthwhile endeavor for leadership development. And so you can stay in a position and you can wield all the power and make it feel really good selfishly. But if you want to develop the team, and honestly, if you want people to trust you and love you, you can't lord it over people. You just can't, you know. And I think you're more effective if you use referent power than if you just lord it over people. The thing about this framework, you can become more influential when you use referent power, when you care for people, when you build trust with people, when you develop a culture where people want to follow you. So I love this framework because like you can grow in your leadership ability, and you can grow, and it's counterintuitive, right? Growing in your humility and leadership actually helps you to become more influential.
Those words are so true. Leaders like power. Everybody likes power.
Yeah.
And it's tough. But in leadership, it's our job to serve others. And so if power and leadership is such a double-edged sword, how can leaders make sure to use their power ethically, responsibly, especially in high pressure, high stakes situations?
First thing, one of the most important things, to get a mentor. They'll help you. You know, have a mentor that you can talk to and that'll walk alongside you. And like, I have people that help me, that I can call and say, here's the situation. What have you done in the past? You've done this before. What's going to happen? Help me walk through this. And so a mentor can help you do that. Again, and again, developing a reflective practice about your leadership development and growth just kind of helps you to track what it is that you're doing and help you to become better. And I think we brought this up. I know we brought this up before. Have a fellowship. Identify people to be in your fellowship. Each leader needs a fellowship, so have a mentor, have a peer, have voices in your life that build you up. Have a wizard, someone that knows more than you. Have a king, somebody that has that has positional power. Think about that, right? And have a little dwarf with an axe, and an elf with a bow, and then have some hobbits that go along with you. And most importantly, have a Sam. Have somebody that'll go with you anywhere and be by your side and walk alongside you. That just kind of helps, in your use of power, ethically and responsibly. Like, they'll help you. They'll walk alongside with you and tell you whether it's a good decision or not. Yeah, mentor, collective practices, fellowship. These are all things that we reiterate over and over again, but all of those things just kind of help you to make, be a better leader.
So if leadership is a continual process, and believe me, I'm all about the process, what habits, practices, resources do you recommend for leaders who want to deepen their understanding of power and grow their leadership journey?
So first of all, I think it's important that listening to this podcast and learning more about the power bases, or building up leadership competency, or understanding the emotional side of leadership development. These are all the topics that we've covered so far in identity and influence. You're already working on it by listening to this podcast. So I want to highlight that there's a reason why Mo's putting out this content and this information. And it's to help leaders to develop their leadership ability and leadership competency. And that's the reason why I'm sharing these lessons and writing about these things, like to give people categories to be better leaders. And then have a leadership mentor. like one specific, like I got a bunch of mentors in my life, but someone that I go to learn about leadership. This, like I have a mentor that helps me with finances and money. I have a mentor that helps me with, Christian formation, spiritual formation things. I have one that's like any theological question that I have, I give them a call. But when it comes to leadership, I have a leadership mentor, and I've written lessons about him, and we'll get to that someday. But he was mentored by Peter Drucker. He had Peter Drucker as, and so like he's got like some leadership insights and some psychology about leadership that like I love talking to him because he will break it down for me and help me to understand leadership and management practices in a way that I can't think of, because he's been in situations and he's had Peter Drucker as a mentor that's kind of helped him think through his leadership practice, you know. So, but not only does he have amazing leadership lessons to teach, he's done some amazing things. And so having someone like that to help me in my leadership reflection just helps me to grow in leadership. I'm not just doing my reflective practices by myself. I do it with a mentor. And so I think these are some of the things that can help us to deepen our understanding of power and grow in our leadership journey.
Man, that's great. Anybody who is mentored by Peter Drucker is worth listening to.
Yeah, he's got some good stuff for sure.
Oh man. Well, that's why we're talking, because I need that stuff. So before we go, Dr. Lem, are there any books, tools, other frameworks that have significantly influenced your perspective on leadership and power? And can you share those?
Yeah, so well, you can take a look at French and Raven's work, and their work is called The Basis of Power. It came out in 1959, but like I think it's still foundational in our understanding of leadership. And then there's this book, it's controversial for some people, but Robert Greene wrote a book called The 48 Laws of Power. It's really fascinating, and he has 48 laws, and he'll walk through, here's the obedience of the law, here's disobedience of the law, and then just give you a bunch of examples of how you can use the laws of power. And it's pretty interesting, and he's got some really, really good insights, just taking a look at history and taking a look at leaders from the past and just pulling out lessons from them. And then honestly, I think I mentioned this a little earlier, but if you read, just go back to all the leadership books that you've read so far, the ones that you have in your library, and then read those leadership books again with the lens of power bases, and using this French and Raven framework really gives you nuance. Like it gives you a deeper understanding of what, you know, Maxwell or Lencioni or whoever you're going to read talk about, because then you have these categories to understand. Oh, that is the power that drives that leadership. That is the power base that they use to develop this or to move this company or to make all this kind of money. Like, and then what you're going to find is referent power shows up all over the place. So I think just having these new categories and then going back to all the books that you've read before really kind of helps you to better understand leadership.
Yeah, I like that. In fact, I never read the 48 Laws of Power because of the negative connotations. And then you told me to read it, and I did, and I love it. And it's now, I think it's on my top 50 now. So
Yes.
go out and get that. So insightful, thought provoking, as always,
Thank you.
understanding what drives leadership and the role that power gives us as leaders, and how we can use that correctly to evaluate
Mhm.
our own influence and effectiveness is just, that's leadership gold. So before we go, do you have any final words of wisdom for our listeners who are striving to lead with integrity, purpose, and influence?
Yeah. Even before you heard this podcast or heard about these power bases, you've used them, right? You as a leader you've wielded these power bases, right? And now that you have these categories, it gives you just a whole another level and deeper understanding of reflecting on leadership practice. And we want you to be a better leader. That's part of the reason why we're sharing all of this stuff. That's part of the reason why you're listening to this. And so do the self work and take a look at your leadership ability. Take a look at your leadership development. Which power base have you used too much? Which power base got you in trouble? Which power bases, or a combination of power bases have led to your most effective leadership actions. Like use these categories to develop your leadership ability and build your influence. And again, thanks for listening and thanks for just giving us a couple of moments to talk about this stuff.
Thank you, Dr. Lem, for sharing
Thank
your
you.
expertise with us today.
Yeah,
And to
man.
our
Thanks for having
listeners,
me.
remember, leadership is about influence. It's about how you use the power that you are given. It's always about the legacy that you leave behind. Thanks for listening to the Rising Tide Leadership Podcast, Identity and Influence. We'll see you next time.
Thanks.